"Nobody wants me," she sobbed, until a rich cowboy stepped onto the stage. On a scorching summer day in 1887, a 3-year-old girl stood on an auction block, silent as death itself, while a crowd of strangers decided her worth. They called her broken, defective, not worth the feed it would take to keep her alive. The auctioneer raised his gavel for the final time, ready to send her back to a fate worse than abandonment, until a man in a dusty coat and worn boots stepped forward and changed everything. This is their story. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The heat rose from the packed dirt street in shimmering waves, distorting the already ugly scene unfolding in the town square of Clemens Ridge. It was auction day, the kind that drew farmers looking for field hands, wealthy widows seeking house staff, and opportunists hunting for bargains on human labor dressed up as charity. Lila Grace didn't know it was called an auction. She didn't know much of anything anymore. She stood on a wooden platform that had been hastily constructed in front of the general store, her bare feet burning against sun-baked planks. The dress they'd given her that morning, if you could call it a dress, hung off her skeletal frame like a flour sack, stained and torn at the hem. Her hair, once perhaps blonde or light brown, was matted and dull, hacked short in uneven chunks to deal with lice. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They were empty, not sad, not frightened, just gone. "Lot number 17, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm of a man selling livestock. "Female child, approximately 3 years of age, healthy enough, quiet disposition." A woman in the front row snorted. "Quiet? That thing hasn't made a sound in 2 hours. Something's wrong with her head." "She's simple?" called out a man in farmer's overalls. The auctioneer shifted uncomfortably. Beside the platform stood Mrs. Pemberton, the tight-lipped director of the county orphan asylum, her face pinched with perpetual disapproval. She stepped forward, her voice crisp and businesslike. "The child is physically sound. She's been examined by our physician. No deformities, no disease. She's simply willful, refuses to speak, refuses to engage, but with firm discipline and proper Christian guidance, she could be made useful for light household work in a few years." "A few years?" The woman in the front row shook her head. "I need help now, not a charity project." "What's her name?" someone asked. Mrs. Pemberton consulted a ledger. "The intake records list her as Lila Grace Morrison. Parents deceased, no living relatives willing to claim her. She came to us 6 months ago." 6 months. It felt like 6 lifetimes to the little girl on the platform. Lila didn't remember much from before. There were fragments. A woman's voice singing, the smell of bread baking, warmth and softness. Then sickness. Fever. People crying. Then nothing. Then the asylum. The asylum wasn't a place you forgot. It was a place that hollowed you out from the inside. "Do I hear 50 cents to start?" the auctioneer called out. Silence. He cleared his throat. 25 cents? More silence. A few people turned away, losing interest. "Look," said a rancher near the back. "I came here for able-bodied workers, not damaged goods. Even my dogs eat more than they're worth at that age." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Lila didn't react. She'd learned not to react to anything. Reactions brought attention. Attention brought punishment. The auctioneer was sweating now, and not just from the heat. Surely someone can offer Christian charity to this poor orphan child. Think of the good work you'd be doing providing a home to one of God's innocent— "Innocent?" Mrs. Pemberton interrupted sharply. "Let's be clear about what you're purchasing, should anyone be interested. This child is difficult. She hoards food, she refuses to sleep, she doesn't respond to correction or kindness. The asylum has tried everything: firm discipline, isolation, extra chores, reduced rations. Nothing breaks through. She's like a little ghost, just taking up space." "Then why bring her?" demanded the woman in front. "Because the asylum is overcrowded," Mrs. Pemberton said flatly. "And there are limits to charity. We need the bed for children who can be helped. This one, well, we've done what we can." The auctioneer tried again, his enthusiasm fading. 10 cents? Anyone? A merchant raised his hand halfway, then lowered it when his wife elbowed him sharply in the ribs. Lila's legs ached from standing so long without moving. The sun beat down on her head, her stomach cramped with hunger. They hadn't fed her that morning, Mrs. Pemberton explaining that it was wasteful to feed children before an auction when the new owners would want to establish their own feeding schedules. "This is pointless," someone muttered. The auctioneer looked to Mrs. Pemberton, who nodded curtly. He raised his gavel. "If there are no offers, this lot will be returned to institutional care. Going once." In the back of Lila's mind, behind the walls she'd built to survive, something stirred. She knew what return to institutional care meant. It meant the dark room. The room where children went when they were more trouble than they were worth. Some came back. Most didn't. Going twice. She didn't want to go back to the dark room, but she also didn't know how to want anything strongly enough to fight for it anymore. So she stood there, silent and still, a 3-year-old girl already half gone from the world. The gavel began its descent. "Hold!" The voice came from the edge of the square, deep and rough from disuse. The crowd turned. A man stood at the periphery of the gathering, one boot propped on the edge of a water trough. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dusty range clothes that had seen hard use. Dark hair touched with gray at the temples. A face weathered by sun and wind and something harder, grief maybe, or regret. He carried himself with the kind of stillness that came from spending more time with animals than people. "I said hold," he repeated, straightening up. His eyes were fixed on the platform, on the small figure standing there like a condemned prisoner awaiting execution. The auctioneer blinked. "Mr. Rourke, I didn't realize you were in town." "I'm here now." Caleb Rourke moved through the crowd, which parted instinctively. He had the kind of presence that made people step aside, not from fear exactly, but from a recognition of something immovable. He'd come to Clemens Ridge for supplies and to meet with his banker about expanding his cattle operation. He'd planned to be in and out within a few hours, avoiding the auction entirely. Caleb Rourke avoided most things that required interaction with the human race. But he'd heard the auctioneer's voice as he loaded sacks of feed onto his wagon. Heard the words "lot number 17" and "female child," and something had pulled him toward the square against his better judgment. Now he stood in front of the platform, looking up at the little girl. She didn't look back at him. Her gaze was fixed on something in the middle distance, somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the town, beyond everything. "How much?" Caleb asked. The auctioneer's face brightened with mercenary hope. "Well now, Mr. Rourke, for a man of your standing, I'm sure we can come to a fair—" "How much?" Caleb repeated. Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward, her expression shifting to calculated interest. Caleb Rourke owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties. He was known to be a hard man, but honest, wealthy, but reclusive. She'd heard the stories. A wife and baby, both lost to fever years ago. No family since. No interest in remarrying or socializing. Just his ranch and his silence. The asylum asks only that the child be placed in a home capable of providing for her basic needs, Mrs. Pemberton said carefully. Given the considerable expense of her care thus far and the investment the county has made in her welfare, we suggest a placement fee of $5. Several people in the crowd gasped. $5 was more than most families spent on necessities in a month. Caleb didn't blink. Done. He pulled a worn leather wallet from his coat and counted out 5 silver dollars, holding them up in the afternoon sun. The auctioneer practically leaped down from the platform to take them. "Excellent! Sold to Mr. Caleb Rourke for $5. A fine act of Christian charity, sir. Truly." "It's not charity," Caleb said quietly. His eyes were still on the child. "I'm not doing it to be a good Christian." Of course," the auctioneer babbled, pocketing the money before Rourke could change his mind. "Mrs. Pemberton will handle the paperwork. The child is yours, sir, legally and binding." Mrs. Pemberton already had her documents ready, laying them out on a small table someone had brought. "If you'll just sign here, Mr. Rourke, acknowledging receipt of the child and accepting full responsibility for her care and conduct." Caleb signed without reading it. The formalities of civilization had long ceased to interest him. "The child comes with only what she's wearing," Mrs. Pemberton continued. "We have no additional belongings to transfer. She should be capable of basic tasks within a few years if properly trained. I recommend a firm hand and regular discipline. Spare the rod and spoil the child, as they say. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He turned back to the platform where Lila still stood, exactly as she had been, as if the entire transaction had nothing to do with her. He approached slowly, the way he would approach a spooked horse. When he reached the platform, he didn't immediately try to touch her or pick her up. He just stood there, bringing himself to her eye level. "Lila," he said quietly. "That's your name, right? Lila Grace?" No response. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. "I'm Caleb. I'm taking you home with me now. To my ranch. It's about an hour's ride from here. I'm going to pick you up and put you in the wagon. I'm not going to hurt you." Still nothing. It was like talking to a statue. Caleb had spent years working with traumatized animals, horses broken by cruel handlers, cattle so wild they'd rather die than be penned. He recognized the signs. This child wasn't defiant or willful. She was surviving the only way she knew how. Gently, moving slowly enough that she could track every motion, he reached up and lifted her off the platform. She weighed almost nothing, just bones and skin wrapped in that awful dress. She didn't fight him, but she didn't relax either. She went rigid in his arms, her whole body locked in that terrible stillness. "It's all right," he murmured, knowing she probably didn't believe him, might not even hear him. "You're safe now." The crowd was already dispersing, the entertainment over. Mrs. Pemberton handed him a single sheet of paper, Lila's official transfer of custody, and departed with the auctioneer, no doubt to sell off the remaining lots of human cargo. Caleb carried Lila to his wagon, which was loaded with supplies from the general store. He'd made a space in the back filled with empty feed sacks for cushioning. He set her down carefully in that space. "You can sit or lie down, whichever you want," he told her. "It's about an hour to the ranch. If you're thirsty, there's a water canteen right here." He placed it within her reach. "If you need to stop for any reason, you let me know." Lila sat exactly where he placed her, hands folded in her lap, eyes staring at nothing. Caleb climbed up onto the driver's seat and clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon lurched into motion, leaving Clemens Ridge behind. For the first 20 minutes, he didn't look back. He focused on the road, on the familiar landscape rolling by. Golden grasslands dotted with scrub brush, distant mountains purple against the horizon, the vast blue sky that seemed to go on forever. This was the world he understood. Open spaces. Silence. Things that made sense. A child made no sense, especially this child. Why had he stopped the auction? Why had he spoken up? He told himself for years that he was done with caring, done with opening himself up to loss. After Margaret and the baby died, he'd built walls higher and thicker than the ones around any fort. He'd become exactly what the townspeople whispered he was. A hard man, alone by choice, emotionally unreachable. But something about seeing that little girl on the platform, about the casual cruelty of the crowd dismissing her as worthless, about that terrible emptiness in her eyes. It had cracked something inside him, something he thought was dead and buried. After 30 minutes, he risked a glance back. Lila hadn't moved. She sat in the exact position he'd left her, hands still folded, eyes still distant. The water canteen sat untouched beside her. "You can drink if you're thirsty," he called back. "It's clean water, I promise." No response. He turned back to the road, jaw tight. This was going to be harder than breaking wild horses. At least horses eventually responded to patience and consistency. This child looked like she'd been broken so thoroughly that there might not be anything left to reach. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon when the ranch finally came into view. Rourke Ranch sprawled across the valley floor, thousands of acres of grazing land, a main house built from good timber and stone, a large barn, several outbuildings, corrals, and in the distance cattle dotting the grasslands like dark stones. It was a beautiful, lonely place, exactly what Caleb had wanted after the funerals. Somewhere he could work himself to exhaustion and not have to make conversation or explain himself or pretend to be anything other than what he was. As the wagon rolled up to the main house, the front door opened and Agnes Miller stepped out onto the porch. Agnes was the only other person who lived on the ranch full-time. She was a widow in her late 50s, sturdy and no-nonsense, who'd answered Caleb's advertisement for a housekeeper 5 years ago. She cooked, cleaned, kept the accounts, and asked no questions about why a wealthy rancher chose to live like a hermit. In return, Caleb paid her well and left her alone. She took one look at the wagon, at Caleb's face, and then at the small figure in the back, and her expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and then something softer. "Mr. Rourke," she said carefully as he pulled the horses to a stop, "that appears to be a child." "It is." "And she's here because—" "I bought her." Agnes's eyebrows shot up. "You bought her?" "At the orphan auction in town, $5. "I see." Agnes moved down the porch steps, approaching the wagon slowly. She peered into the back where Lila sat, unchanged and unchanging. "Dear Lord, how old is she?" "3, they said. Name's Lila Grace." Agnes's face went pale. 3 years old? And they were auctioning her off like livestock? "Yes." For a long moment, Agnes just stared at the child. Then she looked up at Caleb with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, something fierce and protective. "Well," she said briskly, "we better get her inside. She looks half-starved, and those feet have been walking on hot wood. Come here, sweetheart." She reached into the wagon, moving with the confident efficiency of a woman who'd raised 4 children of her own before widowhood. But when she tried to pick Lila up, the child went even more rigid than before, if that was possible. "All right," Agnes said softly. "All right, little one? I'm just going to carry you inside where it's cooler. No one's going to hurt you." Lila didn't fight, but her whole body was trembling now, a fine vibration like a wire pulled too tight. Caleb climbed down from the driver's seat. "Let me. She's already been handed off once today. Might as well keep it consistent." He lifted Lila again, and again she went rigid. He carried her into the house while Agnes hurried ahead to prepare. The interior of the ranch house was spacious and well-built but sparsely decorated, functional rather than homey. Caleb had never seen the point in making it comfortable when he spent most of his time in the barn or on the range anyway. Agnes directed him to place Lila in a chair at the kitchen table. The moment he set her down, she assumed that same position, hands folded, eyes empty, completely still. "Has she spoken at all?" Agnes asked quietly. "Not a word. They said at the auction that she refuses to talk. The woman from the asylum called her willful." Agnes made a disgusted sound. "Willful. That child isn't willful. She's terrified. Look at her." They both looked. Lila sat like a small statue, barely breathing. "What was your plan here, Mr. Rourke?" Agnes asked, not unkindly. "If you don't mind my asking." Caleb ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't have a plan. I just couldn't let them send her back." "Back where?" "To the asylum, or worse." Agnes nodded slowly, understanding dawning. "And now?" "Now I guess we figure it out. She'll need a proper room, clothes, food, whatever else children need." "Love," Agnes said quietly. "Children need love and safety and patience, things that are in short supply in an orphan asylum, I'd wager." She turned to the stove, stoking the fire. "First things first. We'll get some warm food into her, clean her up, find her something better than that rag to wear. Then we'll worry about the rest." While Agnes prepared a simple meal of broth and soft bread, Caleb stood awkwardly in his own kitchen, uncertain what to do with himself. He'd handled every kind of crisis on this ranch: drought, disease, difficult births, predators, natural disasters. But this? A traumatized child who wouldn't speak or make eye contact? This was completely outside his experience. Agnes set a bowl of warm broth and a piece of buttered bread in front of Lila. "Here you go, sweetheart. I know you must be hungry. This is chicken broth. It's good and warm and will settle your stomach. The bread is fresh from this morning. Eat as much or as little as you like." Lila stared at the food. "Go on," Agnes encouraged gently. "It's yours. No one's going to take it away." Still, no movement. Caleb pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, trying to make himself less imposing. "Lila, the food is for you. You can eat it." The little girl's eyes flickered, just barely, toward him, then back to the bowl. Minutes passed in silence. The broth began to cool. Agnes exchanged a worried glance with Caleb. Then, slowly, Lila's hand moved. She reached out, not for the spoon Agnes had provided, but directly into the bowl. Her fingers closed around a piece of chicken, and she brought it to her mouth, chewing mechanically while her eyes remained fixed on the table. "That's it," Agnes murmured. "Good girl." But as Lila continued to eat, still with her fingers, still with that mechanical precision, Caleb noticed something that made his chest tighten. She wasn't just eating, she was hoarding. After every few bites, her free hand would sneak pieces of bread into the folds of her dress, hiding them. She'd glance up quickly, just a flash, to see if anyone was going to stop her, then continue the pattern. Eat, hide, eat, hide. "Let her," Agnes whispered when Caleb started to speak. "She's been hungry before, really hungry. She doesn't trust that there will be food later." So they let her eat and hoard in equal measure until the bowl was empty and her dress pockets were stuffed with damp bread. When she finished, she placed her hands back in her lap and went still again, as if the whole thing had been mechanical rather than voluntary. Agnes cleared the bowl and brought a basin of warm water and a soft cloth. "Let's get you cleaned up a bit, shall we?" But when she moved to touch Lila's face, the child flinched, a sharp, violent jerk that spoke of learned reflexes. Agnes froze. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I won't touch you if you don't want me to, but you've got some dirt on your face and your hands could use washing. Would it be all right if I helped you with that?" No response. "I'll tell you exactly what I'm going to do before I do it, all right? I'm going to put this cloth in the warm water, see? Now I'm wringing it out so it's damp but not dripping. Now I'm going to touch your hand, just your hand, to clean it. Is that all right?" Lila didn't consent, but she didn't pull away when Agnes gently took her small hand and began washing the dirt and food residue from her fingers. The woman worked slowly, carefully, narrating every movement. "There we go, much better. Now the other hand. Good. Now if it's all right, I'd like to wash your face." It took 20 minutes to clean the child, and by the end Agnes's eyes were bright with unshed tears. The process revealed bruises, old ones, faded to yellow and green, on Lila's arms and legs, signs of rough handling, at minimum. "Mr. Rourke," Agnes said tightly, "we should have the doctor come out and examine her properly." "Tomorrow," Caleb agreed. "It's too late today, and I think she's had enough of strangers for one day." Agnes nodded. "I'll prepare the spare room upstairs for her. It has a window with a nice view, and it's far from the noise of the barn. She'll need night clothes. I'll see what I can fashion from some of my things for tonight. Tomorrow we can get proper children's clothes from town." As Agnes headed upstairs, Caleb was left alone in the kitchen with Lila. The sun was setting now, orange light slanting through the windows. He could hear cattle lowing in the distance, the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into evening. "Lila," he said quietly, "I want you to understand something. You're not going back to the asylum. This is your home now. I'm not good at this. I don't know much about children, but I promise you 3 things. I won't hurt you. I won't let anyone else hurt you. And you'll always have food and a warm bed." He didn't expect a response and didn't get one, but he thought maybe there was a slight change in her breathing, a tiny crack in that defensive stillness. Agnes returned with her arms full of linens. "The room's ready. Let's get her settled for the night." Caleb carried Lila upstairs to a room that had been empty since he'd built the house. It was simply furnished, a bed, a dresser, a rocking chair by the window. Agnes had opened the curtains to let in the last of the daylight and turned down the covers on the bed. "I've put a chamber pot under the bed in case she needs it in the night," Agnes explained. "And there's a glass of water on the nightstand. The door doesn't lock from the outside, only the inside. She can lock herself in if she wants privacy." They dressed Lila in one of Agnes's old nightgowns, rolled and pinned to fit her tiny frame. She looked even smaller in the too large bed, like a doll someone had placed there and forgotten. "We'll leave a lamp burning low," Agnes said, "in case she wakes up frightened. This is a new place and everything's strange." Caleb stood in the doorway, feeling utterly useless. "If you need anything," he said to Lila, "my room is just down the hall. Agnes sleeps downstairs near the kitchen. You're not alone." Those empty eyes stared back at him. Agnes pulled the covers up to Lila's chin. "Sleep well, sweetheart. You're safe here. I promise." They left the door cracked open and retreated downstairs. In the kitchen, Agnes sank into a chair, suddenly looking her age. "That poor baby," she whispered. "What on earth did they do to her in that place?" Caleb poured them both coffee from the pot on the stove. "Nothing good." "She's so young, 3 years old. She should be playing with toys and asking endless questions and getting into mischief, not sitting like a terrified ghost." "Can she come back from this?" Caleb asked. It was the question that had been eating at him since he'd signed those papers. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've seen children recover from terrible things, but I've also seen children who were broken beyond repair. The mind is a fragile thing, especially in the very young. What she needs is time, safety, and consistency. She needs to learn that the world isn't always cruel. That's going to take patience. I've got patience. For horses and cattle, yes, but children are different. They need more than just patience. They need affection, gentleness, things that—" She paused delicately. "Things I'm not known for," Caleb finished. "I wasn't going to say that. But it's true." He stared into his coffee. "Margaret used to say I had a gift with animals because I didn't expect them to be anything but what they were. No judgment, no demands, just acceptance." "Maybe that's what Lila needs too," Agnes suggested. "Acceptance. Time to be whatever she needs to be until she's ready to be more." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the house creak and settle around them. Caleb found himself straining to hear any sound from upstairs, crying, movement, anything. But there was only silence. "I should check on her," he said finally. "Give her a bit more time. Let her settle." But Caleb was already moving toward the stairs. He climbed them quietly and approached the slightly open door of Lila's room. She was exactly where they'd left her, lying on her back under the covers, staring at the ceiling. The lamplight cast soft shadows across the room. She hadn't moved, hadn't adjusted the covers, hadn't done anything to make the space her own. Caleb stood in the hallway, watching through the crack in the door. What had he done? What had he been thinking, taking on a traumatized child when he could barely handle his own grief? But then he remembered the auction block, remembered that empty platform and the auctioneer's gavel falling, remembered where she would have gone if he hadn't stepped forward. Number. He'd made the right choice, the only choice. Everything else they'd figure out as they went. He was about to retreat when he heard it, so quiet he almost missed it. A sound, not words, not crying, just a small, sharp intake of breath. Then another. The breathing pattern of someone trying very hard not to cry and failing. Caleb's hand was on the door before he thought about it, pushing it open gently. "Lila?" She didn't look at him, but the hitching breaths continued. In the lamplight, he could see tears sliding silently down her cheeks. He approached the bed slowly. "It's all right to cry. You're safe here. You can cry if you need to." The tears came faster, but still she made no sound. It was the most heartbreaking thing he'd ever witnessed, a child who'd learned that even grief had to be silent. Without thinking, Caleb sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't touch her, didn't try to hold her. He just sat there, a solid presence in the darkness. "I know you don't know me," he said quietly. "I know you have no reason to trust me or anyone else, but I meant what I said downstairs. You're not going back. This is your home now, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're safe here." The silent tears continued for a long time. Caleb sat through all of it, occasionally murmuring quiet reassurances, mostly just being present. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her and the tears slowed, then stopped. Her breathing evened out into sleep. Caleb stood carefully, not wanting to wake her. He adjusted the covers one more time and turned the lamp down lower. Not out, but dim enough that it wouldn't disturb her sleep. As he reached the door, he looked back one more time at the small figure in the bed. She looked even tinier in sleep, curled on her side now, one hand tucked under her cheek. "Nobody wants me," the woman at the auction had said mockingly, imitating what she assumed a worthless child might say. Standing in the doorway of his ranch house, Caleb Rourke made a silent promise to the sleeping child. Somebody wanted her now, and he'd be damned if he'd let anyone make her feel worthless ever again. The first week passed in a strange, silent rhythm that felt more like walking on broken glass than establishing a routine. Caleb had faced plenty of challenges in his life. Droughts that killed half his herd, winters so brutal they froze cattle where they stood, even a stampede that nearly cost him his leg. but nothing had prepared him for the particular helplessness of trying to reach a child who'd locked herself away from the world. Lila ate when food was placed in front of her, but always with that same mechanical precision. She hoarded pieces in her dress pockets until Agnes gently explained that the pockets would be washed and the food would spoil, and that there would always be more food at the next meal. The hoarding continued anyway. Trust, Caleb was learning, couldn't be explained into existence. She slept, but badly. Caleb's room was close enough that he could hear her wake in the night, always silent, never crying out, but he could hear the creak of floorboards as she paced her room in the darkness. He'd started leaving his door open so she could see the lamplight from his room, a small beacon in the unfamiliar house. On the third day, Dr. Matthias came out from town at Caleb's request. He was an older man, gentle-voiced and patient, who delivered half the babies in the county and set twice as many broken bones. "I'll need to examine her," he told Caleb and Agnes in the kitchen, while Lila sat at the table, staring at nothing. "Check for injuries, malnutrition, anything that might need medical attention." "She doesn't like to be touched," Agnes warned. Dr. Matthias nodded. "I've worked with frightened children before. We'll go slow." But slow wasn't slow enough. The moment the doctor approached with his medical bag, Lila went rigid. When he tried to place his stethoscope against her chest to listen to her heartbeat, she jerked away so violently she nearly fell off the chair. "Easy now," Dr. Matthias said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need to make sure you're healthy." Lila's breathing had gone shallow and rapid. Her eyes were wide now, not empty, but filled with something worse, pure terror. Caleb stepped forward. "Stop. You're scaring her." "Mr. Rourke, I need to examine—" "I said stop." Caleb's voice carried the kind of authority that made even the doctor pause. He crouched down beside Lila's chair, making himself small and unthreatening. "Lila, Dr. Matthias is a good man. He helps people when they're hurt or sick, but if you don't want him to touch you right now, he won't. That's your choice." The doctor opened his mouth to protest, but Agnes silenced him with a sharp look. Caleb continued speaking to Lila in that same quiet, steady voice. "Here's what's going to happen. The doctor is going to sit at the other end of this table. He's not going to come any closer. He's going to ask you some questions, and you don't have to answer if you don't want to. Then he's going to look at you, just look, not touch, and see if there's anything that needs tending. If at any point you want him to leave, you just stand up and walk away. Nobody's going to force you. Understand?" Lila's breathing was still too fast, but the wild panic in her eyes had dimmed slightly. Dr. Matthias, to his credit, adapted quickly. He moved to the far end of the table and sat down, keeping his medical bag closed. "Hello, Lila. My name is Dr. Matthias. I've been a doctor for almost 40 years. I help people feel better when they're sick or hurt. Can you tell me if anything hurts right now?" Silence. "All right, that's all right. How about this? If something hurts, could you point to where it hurts?" More silence, but Lila's hand moved slightly, touching her own stomach. "Your stomach hurts?" the doctor asked gently. The smallest nod. The first purposeful communication she'd made since arriving at the ranch. Agnes drew in a sharp breath. Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief exactly, but hope. "I see. Is it a sharp pain or a dull ache?" No response to that. The question was probably too complex. Dr. Matthias tried again. "Does it hurt all the time or just sometimes?" Lila held up one finger, then another. "Two. Sometimes." "After you eat?" A nod. The doctor's expression softened with understanding. "I think what you're feeling is your stomach adjusting to regular food again. When people go a long time without enough to eat, their stomachs can hurt when they start eating normally. It should get better in a few days. In the meantime, smaller meals more often might help. Mrs. Miller, could you—" "I'll adjust her portions," Agnes said quickly. The examination continued like that, a slow dance of questions and tiny gestures. "Doctor." Matthias never moved from his end of the table. He asked Lila to show him her hands, her arms, her legs. Just show him, not let him touch. He noted the old bruises, the raw patches on her feet from going barefoot, the way her collarbones stood out too sharply. Malnutrition, obviously. he told Caleb and Agnes later when Lila had been settled in the parlor with a picture book Agnes had found in the attic. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but she's severely underweight for her age. The bruising is consistent with rough handling, grabbing, maybe restraining. I don't see evidence of broken bones, current or healed, which is something. The stomach pain will resolve with proper feeding. What concerns me more is her mental state. She's traumatized, Caleb said flatly. Severely. The refusal to speak, the hoarding behavior, the way she dissociates. These are all protective mechanisms. Her mind is trying to keep her safe from a world that's been nothing but cruel. Doctor. Matthias packed his medical bag slowly. I've seen this before in children from similar situations. Some recover given time and stability. Others, he trailed off. Others what? Agnes demanded. Others never fully come back. The damage is too deep. I'm not saying that to discourage you, but you need to understand what you're dealing with. This child needs more than food and shelter. She needs patience, consistency, and probably years of gentle care before she might start to trust the world again. If she ever does. After the doctor left, Caleb found Lila exactly where Agnes had placed her, sitting on the floor with the picture book closed beside her. She hadn't opened it. She was simply staring at the wall, hands folded in her lap. He sat down in a nearby chair, not too close, and picked up the book. This was my wife's when she was a little girl. It's got pictures of animals and farms and families. Would you like me to read it to you? No response, but no rejection either. Caleb opened the book and began to read. His voice was rusty at first. He hadn't read aloud since Margaret died, but he pushed through. He read about a little girl who lived on a farm, who had adventures with barnyard animals and learned lessons about kindness and bravery. As he read, he watched Lila from the corner of his eye. She didn't look at the pictures, didn't react to the story. But her breathing slowed, and some of the tension left her shoulders. She was listening, even if she couldn't show it. When he finished the book, he closed it gently. If you ever want me to read more, you just bring me a book. Anytime. Even in the middle of the night, if you can't sleep. He stood to leave, but something made him pause. On impulse, he pulled a worn bandana from his pocket, red with white spots, soft from years of use. He'd carried it since his early ranching days, used it for everything from wiping sweat to bandaging minor cuts. Here, he said, placing it on the floor within her reach. This is for you, in case you need something to hold on to. It's yours now. He left before she could react, but when he glanced back from the doorway, Lila's hand was moving slowly toward the bandana. The days began to take on a pattern. Caleb would rise before dawn, as he always had, and tend to the ranch work. Agnes would prepare breakfast and coax Lila into eating. The child never spoke, but she'd started to respond to direct questions with small gestures, nods, shakes of her head, occasionally pointing. Caleb made a point of including Lila in the daily routine, not forcing her participation, but making space for her presence. When he worked in the barn, he'd leave the door open so she could watch from a safe distance if she wanted. Agnes started bringing her into the kitchen during meal preparation, letting her observe without demanding help. It was on the 10th day that something shifted. Caleb was in the barn tending to a mare who was close to foaling. The horse was restless, pacing her stall, clearly uncomfortable. He'd brought in fresh hay and water and was speaking to her in the low, soothing voice he used with nervous animals. Easy, girl. I know it hurts. First time's always the hardest, but you're strong. You're going to do just fine. He didn't hear the small footsteps behind him until he turned and nearly jumped out of his skin. Lila stood just inside the barn door, barely visible in the shadows. She'd never ventured out here before, never shown interest in anything beyond the walls of the house. Lila, he said, keeping his voice calm despite his surprise. You startled me. It's all right, though. You can come in if you want. She didn't move closer, but she didn't leave either. Her eyes were fixed on the mare. This is Juniper, Caleb explained, gesturing to the horse. She's going to have a baby soon. A foal. That's what we call baby horses. She's a little nervous because she's never done this before, but she'll be all right. The mare whinnied, tossing her head. Lila's eyes widened slightly. She's not in pain, Caleb assured her quickly. Well, not bad pain anyway. Just uncomfortable, like having a stomachache, but knowing something good is coming at the end of it. He continued working, talking partly to the horse and partly to Lila, explaining what he was doing and why. He half expected her to get bored and leave, but she stayed, silent and watchful, for over an hour. When he finally finished and headed back to the house for lunch, Lila followed at a distance, like a small shadow. Agnes noticed immediately. "Well now, looks like you made a friend. She just watched me work, didn't say anything." "Didn't run away either," Agnes pointed out. "That's progress." That afternoon, Caleb was repairing a section of fence when he felt that same presence nearby. He glanced up to find Lila sitting on a nearby rock, the red bandana clutched in one hand, watching him work. "Hand me that hammer?" he asked, pointing to where his tools lay spread out on the ground. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Lila stood, walked over to the tools, and carefully picked up the hammer. She carried it to him with both hands, like it was something precious and fragile. "Thank you," Caleb said, taking it from her. Their fingers brushed briefly, and she didn't flinch. "You're a good helper." Something flickered in her eyes. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of what might someday become one. The pattern continued and expanded. Lila began following Caleb around the ranch like a small, silent shadow. She'd watch him work with the horses, mend equipment, check on the cattle in the near pastures. She never spoke, but she'd started responding to simple requests, handing him tools, holding a rope, opening a gate. Agnes reported similar small victories. Lila had started setting the table without being asked. She'd picked up a rag and wiped down a counter. Tiny gestures, but they meant she was becoming aware of her environment as something she could interact with rather than just endure. 2 weeks after her arrival, Caleb was working in the barn when he heard an unfamiliar sound, high-pitched and distressed. He dropped the bridle he'd been oiling and ran toward the noise. He found Lila in Juniper's stall, pressed against the far wall, eyes wide with fear. The mare was in active labor now, and the sounds and smells had clearly frightened the child. "It's all right," Caleb said, scooping Lila up and carrying her out of the stall. "Juniper's having her baby. It's loud and it looks scary, but it's natural. She's going to be fine." He set Lila down outside the stall, but within view. "You can watch if you want, but you have to stay out here where it's safe. Can you do that?" A small nod. Over the next hour, Lila watched transfixed as the mare labored and finally delivered a spindly-legged foal. Caleb talked her through the entire process, explaining what was happening, why the mare made certain noises, what the foal would do when it finally emerged. When the foal finally stood on wobbling legs and took its first nursing, Caleb glanced at Lila. Her eyes were huge, but for the first time since he'd met her, there was something other than emptiness in them. Wonder, amazement, the barest hint of joy. "You want to help me name him?" Caleb asked. Lila looked at him, then back at the foal. She made a soft sound, not quite a word, but closer to speech than she'd come before. It sounded like Bright. "Bright?" Caleb repeated. "You think we should call him Bright?" A definite nod this time. "Bright it is then. That's a good name, a strong name." He stood, brushing hay from his pants. "Come on, let's give Mama and Baby some time to rest. We'll check on them again before supper." As they walked back to the house, Lila's hand slipped into his. Just for a moment, just a brief touch of small fingers against his calloused palm, before she pulled away again. But it was enough. That night, Caleb sat in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed, nursing a cup of coffee and thinking about that tiny hand in his, about the way Lila had looked at the newborn foal, about the sound she'd made that was almost a word. Agnes found him there close to midnight. "Can't sleep?" "Too much thinking." She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. "She's getting better. Slowly, but it's happening. Or we're just seeing what we want to see." "Don't do that," Agnes said sharply. "Don't talk yourself out of hope just because you're scared." Caleb looked up at her, surprised by the edge in her voice. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" Agnes continued. "Keeping everyone at arm's length, convincing yourself you're not capable of caring for anyone, building walls so high you can't see over them yourself. But that little girl upstairs is starting to trust you, and you're terrified of what that means. If I fail her, you won't. You can't know that." "No," Agnes admitted. "I can't, but I can see that you're trying, that you care, even if you won't admit it, that you carried her home and gave her safety when no one else would. That counts for something." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "What if caring isn't enough?" What if she needs more than I can give? Then we'll figure it out together, but you have to stop expecting to fail before you've even really tried. Agnes stood, placing a hand on his shoulder. Get some sleep, Mr. Rourke. Tomorrow's another day, and that child needs you rested and present. 3 weeks in, trouble arrived in the form of Sheriff Coleman and a well-dressed woman Caleb didn't recognize. They rode up to the ranch house mid-morning while Caleb was showing Lila how to brush down one of the gentler horses. The moment Lila saw the strangers, she went rigid. The brush fell from her hand and she bolted, disappearing into the barn's shadows. Caleb bit back a curse and walked out to meet the visitors, his expression hard. Sheriff, what brings you out here? Sheriff Coleman was a decent man, honest but unimaginative, the kind who followed rules because that's what rules were for. Mr. Rourke, this is Miss Thornberry. She's with the County Child Welfare Board. Miss Thornberry was in her 40s, prim and proper with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Rourke, I've come to conduct a welfare check on the minor child in your care. Welfare check, Caleb repeated flatly. Yes. When a child is placed through informal adoption channels, it's standard procedure to ensure the placement is appropriate. Her tone suggested she already doubted it was. Agnes emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. What's this about? Official business, ma'am, Miss Thornberry said. I need to see the child, inspect her living conditions, and verify that she's receiving proper care. She's receiving excellent care, Agnes said firmly. I'll be the judge of that. Where is she? You frightened her, Caleb said, his voice cold. She ran off when she saw strangers. She doesn't trust easily. Miss Thornberry's expression soured. A child running away from authority figures. That's concerning. A traumatized child being startled by unexpected visitors, Caleb corrected. That's understandable. The standoff might have continued, but Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. Look, Mr. Rourke, I know this is inconvenient, but Miss Thornberry has the authority to conduct these checks. The sooner we get it done, the sooner we can all go about our business. Caleb wanted to refuse to send them away, but he knew enough about the law to understand that would only make things worse. Fine. But you approach her slowly, and you don't touch her. She's been through enough. It took 20 minutes to coax Lila out of the barn. Caleb finally found her hiding in an empty stall, pressed into the corner, the red bandana clutched so tightly her knuckles were white. It's all right, he said softly, crouching down. Those people just want to make sure you're being taken care of properly. They're not going to take you away. I won't let them. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the betrayal she'd learned to expect. I promise, Caleb said. You're safe here. This is your home. But we have to show them that everything's all right. Can you do that? Can you be brave for just a little while? The smallest nod. He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. Miss Thornberry's inspection was thorough and invasive. She examined Lila's room, critiquing the sparse furnishings and lack of toys. She questioned Agnes extensively about meal schedules, bathing routines, and educational activities. She made notes in a leather journal, her pen scratching ominously. The child doesn't speak? She asked. She's working through trauma, Agnes said. Dr. Matthias has examined her and says it's not uncommon in cases of severe abuse. Convenient excuse for lack of proper education and socialization. Caleb's jaw tightened. She's 3 years old. She's been here 3 weeks. What exactly do you expect? Miss Thornberry looked at him coolly. I expect to see progress, evidence that this placement is beneficial. Instead, I see a mute child living in isolation with a widower of questionable reputation and an elderly housekeeper. No other children for socialization, no proper schooling, no religious instruction. She doesn't need religious instruction, Caleb said through gritted teeth. She needs safety and time to heal. What she needs is a proper family, a mother figure, structure and discipline within a traditional household. Miss Thornberry closed her journal with a decisive snap. I'll be filing a report recommending review of this placement. The board will make a final determination. You can't just take her away, Agnes protested. I can recommend whatever I deem appropriate for the child's welfare. Good day. After they left, Caleb found Lila back in the barn, sitting in Bright's stall with her arms wrapped around her knees. The foal nuzzled her curiously, and she didn't pull away. He sat down beside her, close but not touching. For a long time, neither of them moved. "I meant what I said," Caleb finally spoke. "You're not going anywhere. I don't care what that woman writes in her report. This is your home, and I'm going to fight to keep it that way." Lila turned her head slightly, looking at him. Her eyes were no longer empty. They were full of questions, fear, and a desperate, fragile hope. "I know you don't have any reason to trust me yet," Caleb continued. "I know people have let you down before. But I'm not them. I'm not going to give up on you. Not ever." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something he'd been working on in the evenings, a small wooden horse he'd carved, about the size of Lila's palm. It wasn't perfect. The legs were a bit uneven and the mane was rough, but it was clearly made with care. "I made this for you," he said, setting it between them. "It's bright, so you can keep him with you even when you're not in the barn." Lila picked up the carving with trembling fingers. She turned it over, examining it from every angle. Then she did something that nearly broke Caleb's heart. She pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes, holding it like it was the most precious thing in the world. That evening, Agnes made Lila's favorite meal, chicken and dumplings with fresh bread and honey. As they ate, she tried to maintain a cheerful demeanor despite the worry etched in every line of her face. "You know what I was thinking?" Agnes said brightly. "We should go into town tomorrow and get you some proper clothes, some pretty dresses and shoes that actually fit. Maybe a new ribbon for your hair. Would you like that?" Lila looked uncertain, but she nodded. "Excellent. We'll make a day of it. Maybe stop by the bakery for something sweet." After Lila had gone to bed, Caleb and Agnes sat in the kitchen, their earlier optimism replaced by grim reality. "What are we going to do?" Agnes asked quietly. "I'm going to see a lawyer. Figure out exactly what rights I have and what they can actually do." "And if the board decides to remove her?" Caleb's expression hardened. "Then they'll have a fight on their hands." The next week brought small joys and lurking dread in equal measure. The trip to town yielded 3 new dresses for Lila, 2 pairs of shoes, hair ribbons, and a rag doll that she carried everywhere alongside her wooden horse and red bandana. She still didn't speak, but her gestures had become more communicative. She'd started shaking her head no when she didn't want something, nodding yes when she did. Small rebellions against the silence she'd wrapped herself in. Caleb met with Evan Brooks, a young lawyer fresh from back east who'd set up practice in Clemens Ridge. Brooks was earnest and idealistic, which Caleb normally would have found annoying, but right now he needed someone who believed in fighting losing battles. "The adoption was legal," Brooks said after reviewing the paperwork. "You paid the placement fee, signed the custody transfer, and filed it with the county clerk. From a technical standpoint, you have as much right to that child as any parent. But informal adoptions can be challenged if the board determines the placement isn't in the child's best interest. Ms. Thornberry's report will carry significant weight." "So what do I do?" Brooks leaned back in his chair. "You document everything, every meal, every improvement, every sign of progress. If they challenge you, we'll need evidence that you're providing superior care compared to institutional alternatives. Letters from Dr. Matthias about her physical and mental health improvements. Character witnesses. Anything that shows you're a fit guardian. I'm a single man living alone on a ranch. That's not exactly traditional. No, but you're also wealthy, stable, and by all accounts treating her well. We can work with that." Brooks paused. "I should warn you, though, if this goes to a hearing, they'll dig into your personal life. Your marriage, your wife's death, why you've remained isolated. Be prepared for that." Caleb nodded grimly. He'd expected as much. As a month after Lila's arrival, something remarkable happened. Caleb was in the barn late one evening, checking on the horses before bed, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find Lila standing there in her nightgown, the wooden horse clutched in one hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "Bad dreams?" A nod this time, and he could see tear tracks on her cheeks. "Come here." He sat down on a hay bale and patted the space beside him. "You're safe. Nothing in your dreams can hurt you here." Lila climbed up beside him, and to his surprise, she leaned against his side. It was the first time she'd initiated physical contact. He put his arm around her carefully, half expecting her to bolt. She didn't. She just sat there, small and warm against him, while her breathing slowly calmed. You want to know a secret? Caleb said quietly. I have bad dreams too sometimes. About losing people I loved, about not being strong enough or fast enough or good enough. Dreams can be terrible that way. They show us our fears when we can't hide from them. Lila tilted her head up to look at him, her eyes wide in the lamplight. But here's what I've learned, he continued. Dreams can't actually hurt us. They feel real and scary, but when we wake up, they're gone. And if the dreams come back, well, we just keep waking up and reminding ourselves that we're safe, that the people who care about us are still here. They sat like that for a long time, until Lila's eyes began to droop. Caleb carried her back to the house and tucked her into bed, and this time when he turned to leave, she caught his sleeve. Stay? The word was barely a whisper, so quiet he almost missed it, but it was a word. Her first word to him. Maybe her first word to anyone in months. Caleb felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he'd built that he hadn't even known was there. Yeah, he said, his voice rough. I'll stay. He pulled the rocking chair close to her bed and sat down. Within minutes, Lila was asleep, one hand curled around her wooden horse, the other clutching the edge of his sleeve. Caleb sat there all night, watching her sleep, and finally let himself acknowledge the terrifying truth he'd been avoiding for weeks. This child had become his. Not on paper, not legally, but in every way that mattered. She'd wrapped herself around his heart without his permission, without him even noticing it happening. And now the thought of losing her, of someone taking her away and sending her back to that awful emptiness. He couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't. Whatever fight was coming, he was ready for it. The summons came on a cold morning in late October, delivered by a nervous deputy who wouldn't meet Caleb's eyes. The County Child Welfare Board was convening a formal custody hearing to determine whether Lila Grace Morrison should remain in Caleb Rourke's care or be removed to a more suitable placement. The hearing was scheduled for November 15th, just 3 weeks away. Caleb read the official notice twice, his jaw tightening with each word. Agnes stood beside him on the porch, her face pale. They're really doing this, she whispered. Yes. Caleb folded the paper carefully, though his hands wanted to crumple it into nothing. They are. Inside, Lila sat at the kitchen table working on her letters. Agnes had started teaching her the alphabet using a slate and chalk, and while the child still rarely spoke, she'd taken to the lessons with quiet intensity. She looked up when they entered, and something in Caleb's expression made her small face close down, that terrible emptiness threatening to return. He crossed to her immediately and knelt beside her chair. Everything's all right. Nothing's changing today? I just got a letter about some meetings I have to attend. Boring grown-up business. Lila's eyes searched his face, looking for the truth beneath the words. She'd gotten better at reading people these past weeks, learning to distinguish real safety from false promises. I need you to trust me, Caleb said quietly. Can you do that? After a long moment, she nodded, but her hand crept across the table to touch his sleeve, holding on like she might anchor him there through sheer will. Evan Brooks arrived at the ranch that afternoon, his arms full of legal documents and his expression grimly determined. He spread papers across Caleb's dining table while Agnes made coffee, and Lila watched from the doorway, the wooden horse clutched in her hand. The board is claiming the placement is inappropriate on multiple grounds, Brooks explained. First, you're an unmarried man with no experience raising children. Second, the ranch is too isolated and lacks proper educational and social opportunities. Third, they're questioning whether the adoption was conducted properly, suggesting there may have been coercion or improper inducement. That's nonsense, Agnes said sharply. He paid what they asked and signed their papers. I know, but Miss Thornbury's report paints a different picture. She claims the child shows signs of continued trauma, lacks proper feminine influence, and isn't receiving adequate care or education. Brooks pulled out another document. She's also found 3 families willing to take Lila, all traditional 2-parent households with other children and strong community ties. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. Those families didn't want her when she was on that auction block. They thought she was broken and worthless. Now suddenly they're lining up? Now she comes with a story, Brooks said quietly. The tragic orphan rescued by the wealthy rancher. Some people find that appealing or profitable, depending on your perspective. They want to use her. Maybe. Or maybe some of them genuinely think they can provide better care. The board will argue that a traditional family environment is superior to what you're offering, regardless of your financial resources. Caleb stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, autumn had painted the grasslands in shades of gold and amber. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. It was beautiful and isolated, and exactly the kind of place Miss Thornbury would condemn as unsuitable for raising a child. "What do I need to do?" he asked, without turning around. "We build a case showing that Lila is thriving under your care. Dr. Matthias needs to testify about her physical and mental health improvements. Agnes can speak to her daily care and education. We need character witnesses who can vouch for you as a guardian. I don't have many friends in town. You have a reputation, though. Honest, fair, good to your workers. We can use that." Brooks hesitated. "There's one more thing. If we can get Lila to speak during the hearing, to express her preference to stay with you, it would carry enormous weight." Caleb turned to look at the doorway where Lila stood watching them. Her eyes were too knowing for a child barely 3 years old. "I won't force her," he said firmly. "She's been forced to do enough things she didn't want to do." "I'm not suggesting force. I'm suggesting we prepare her, give her the choice. If she wants to speak on her own behalf, we should allow that." After Brooks left, Caleb found Lila in the barn with Bright. The foal had grown considerably, his legs stronger and his movements more confident. Lila sat in the straw beside him, stroking his nose while he nuzzled her hair. "Can I sit with you?" Caleb asked. She nodded, scooting over to make room. For a while they just sat in comfortable silence, watching Bright explore his stall. Then Caleb spoke, choosing his words carefully. "Lila, there are some people who think you'd be happier living somewhere else, with a different family, a mama and papa and maybe brothers and sisters." Her whole body went rigid. She turned to stare at him, and the look in her eyes was pure betrayal. "I don't think that," Caleb said quickly. "I think you should stay right here with me and Agnes. But these people, they have the power to make you leave if they decide that's what's best. So we have to convince them they're wrong." Lila's hand shot out and grabbed his arm, her small fingers digging in with desperate strength. "I know. I don't want you to go either, but in order to make you stay, I need help. There's going to be a meeting where a judge asks questions and people talk about what's best for you. If you wanted to tell them that you want to stay here, that would help a lot. But only if you want to. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for." She was shaking now, her breathing rapid and shallow. Caleb pulled her close, and she didn't resist, just pressed herself against him like she was trying to disappear into his coat. "No matter what happens," he said into her hair, "I'm going to fight for you. I promise. You're not going back to that dark place, and you're not going to people who don't really want you. You're mine, and I take care of what's mine." That night, Lila's nightmares returned with a vengeance. Caleb woke to the sound of his door creaking open and found her standing in the hallway, tears streaming silently down her face, clutching her wooden horse and the red bandana. He didn't ask questions, just pulled back his blankets and made room. She climbed into his bed and curled into a tight ball against his side, and he wrapped his arm around her and held on. "You're safe," he murmured. "I've got you. Nothing's going to take you away." She fell asleep like that, and Caleb lay awake until dawn, listening to her breathe and making silent promises to anyone who might be listening. He'd failed to protect his wife and unborn child from fever, but he'd be damned if he failed this little girl. The next 3 weeks were a blur of preparation. Dr. Matthias spent hours documenting Lila's progress, noting her weight gain, the healing of old injuries, and the gradual emergence of normal childhood behaviors. Agnes compiled detailed records of daily routines, meal plans, and educational activities. Evan Brooks interviewed potential witnesses and built legal arguments. Caleb threw himself into making the ranch as presentable as possible. He had the house thoroughly cleaned, bought new furnishings for Lila's room, including a proper bookshelf and toy chest, and even commissioned a local craftsman to build a small swing in the yard. He knew it was partly for show, but he also wanted Lila to have these things, to build her a childhood piece by piece. Lila herself grew quieter as the hearing approached, the progress she'd made seeming to reverse. She stopped attempting words, even the occasional whispered syllables she'd been managing. She went back to hoarding food. At night, she either couldn't sleep at all or woke from nightmares so intense that Caleb started just putting her to bed in his room to begin with. Agnes tried to reassure her with cheerful talk about how everything would be fine, how the mean people would see how happy she was and leave them alone. But children could sense adult fear no matter how well hidden, and Lila knew something terrible was coming. 2 days before the hearing, Sheriff Coleman rode out to the ranch again, this time alone. Caleb met him in the yard, his expression guarded. "I'm not here officially," the sheriff said, dismounting. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. There's talk in town." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that questions why a single man would fight so hard to keep a little girl who's not even his blood. Some people are implying improper motivations." Caleb felt rage surge through him, hot and violent. "That's a damn lie." "I know it is. Anyone who's seen you with that child knows you're just trying to do right by her. But Miss Thornberry's been talking to people, planting seeds. She's building a narrative that you're either a fool being taken advantage of, or worse." The sheriff looked genuinely apologetic. "I thought you should know what you're walking into." After he left, Caleb stood in the yard for a long time, shaking with fury. That they would twist his attempt to give a traumatized child a home into something sick and wrong. It made him want to put his fist through something. Agnes found him there as the sun was setting. "Don't let them poison your mind," she said quietly. "You know the truth. We know the truth. That's what matters. The truth doesn't always win. Then we make it win. We fight with everything we have." The morning of the hearing dawned cold and clear. Caleb dressed in his best suit, the one he'd worn to Margaret's funeral and hadn't touched since. Agnes helped Lila into one of her new dresses, blue calico with white flowers, and braided her hair with a matching ribbon. "You look so pretty," Agnes said, her voice bright despite the tears in her eyes, "like a little princess." Lila stared at her reflection in the mirror, her expression unreadable. She looked like a normal, well-cared-for child, but Caleb could see the terror lurking beneath the surface, the way her hands trembled as she held her wooden horse. The courthouse in Clemens Ridge was an imposing stone building that dominated the town square. By the time they arrived, a crowd had already gathered, curious townspeople, potential witnesses, and notably 3 well-dressed couples who Caleb assumed were the families hoping to claim Lila. He kept her close as they entered, one hand on her shoulder, feeling her shake under his touch. The hearing room was smaller than he'd expected, with wooden benches for spectators and a raised platform where Judge Morrison presided. The judge was an older man, stern-faced and known for strict adherence to the letter of the law. Evan Brooks met them inside, looking young and nervous but determined. "Remember," he said quietly to Caleb, "stay calm no matter what they say. Don't lose your temper. Show them you're stable and in control." Miss Thornberry sat at the opposing table with a lawyer from the county. She looked supremely confident, her posture radiating moral certainty. The hearing began with Judge Morrison reading the formal complaint. The County Child Welfare Board was petitioning to remove Lila Grace Morrison from the custody of Caleb Rourke on the grounds that the placement was inappropriate and not in the child's best interests. "Mr. Brooks, you're representing Mr. Rourke?" the judge asked. "Yes, Your Honor." "And Miss Thornberry, you're presenting the board's case?" "I am, Your Honor." "Proceed." Miss Thornberry stood, her voice clear and carrying. "Your Honor, the board does not make this petition lightly. We understand that Mr. Rourke paid the required placement fee and followed proper procedures. However, in the months since taking custody, it has become clear that this placement is fundamentally unsuitable." She gestured to where Lila sat pressed against Caleb's side. "This child has suffered severe trauma. She requires specialized care, consistent feminine guidance, and a structured family environment. Mr. Rourke, while financially capable, is a single man living in isolation. He has no experience with children, no wife to provide maternal care, and no understanding of a young girl's needs." "That's not true," Agnes hissed from behind them. Brooks put a restraining hand on her shoulder. Miss Thornberry continued, "During my inspection of the ranch, I observed a child who remained nonverbal, exhibited concerning behaviors such as food hoarding, and showed clear signs of continued trauma. The home, while adequate in material terms, lacks the warmth and proper feminine influence a child needs. Mr. Rourke cannot provide the maternal care this girl desperately requires." "Your Honor," Brooks interjected, "if I may—" "You'll have your turn, Mr. Brooks. Miss Thornberry, do you have evidence to support these claims?" "I do. I've prepared a detailed report based on my observations and interviews with relevant parties. She handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Additionally, I have 3 families present today who are willing and eager to provide proper homes for this child. All are traditional 2-parent households with proven track records of child rearing. Judge Morrison flipped through the report, his expression unreadable. Mr. Brooks, your response? Brooks stood, and Caleb was relieved to see his nervousness had been replaced by controlled intensity. Your Honor, the board's case relies on outdated assumptions about family structure and ignores the objective evidence of this child's improvement under Mr. Rourke's care. We will demonstrate through medical testimony and direct observation that Lila has made remarkable progress in the past 2 months, progress that would be catastrophically disrupted by removal to strangers. This isn't about family structure, Miss Thornberry said sharply. It's about what's best for the child. Then let's examine what's actually best for the child, Brooks shot back. Not what looks best on paper or conforms to traditional expectations, but what serves this particular child's needs. The judge raised his hand for silence. I'll hear your evidence, Mr. Brooks. Call your first witness. Dr. Matthias took the stand, his weathered face serious. Brooks led him through his qualifications and his history with Lila. Dr. Matthias, you examined Lila Grace shortly after her arrival at Mr. Rourke's ranch. Can you describe her condition at that time? She was severely malnourished, the doctor said. Underweight by at least 10 pounds for her age. She had multiple bruises in various stages of healing, indicating repeated trauma. Her feet showed evidence of prolonged exposure, burns and abrasions consistent with walking barefoot on rough surfaces. Beyond the physical injuries, she exhibited severe psychological trauma. She was nonverbal, unresponsive to normal stimuli, and showed classic signs of dissociation. And have you examined her since then? I have, most recently 2 days ago. What changes, if any, have you observed? Dr. Matthias looked directly at the judge. The changes have been remarkable. She's gained 12 pounds, putting her within normal weight range for her age. All previous injuries have healed completely. The hoarding behavior Miss Thornberry mentioned has decreased significantly. While she remains primarily nonverbal, she has begun speaking in limited circumstances, which represents substantial progress from complete silence. In your medical opinion, doctor, has this placement been beneficial or harmful to the child? Beneficial without question. The improvement in both physical and mental health has exceeded my expectations. This child was barely surviving when she arrived. Now she's beginning to live. Miss Thornberry's lawyer stood for cross-examination. Dr. Matthias, you mentioned she remains primarily nonverbal. Is that normal for a child her age? No, but given her trauma history, it's expected and improving. And the food hoarding? Decreasing but not eliminated, which is common in children who've experienced food insecurity. So she still exhibits abnormal behaviors? Dr. Matthias's eyes flashed. She exhibits behaviors consistent with severe trauma and consistent with recovery from that trauma. The question isn't whether she's completely healed. That would be impossible in 2 months. The question is whether she's moving in the right direction, and the answer is an emphatic yes. Agnes testified next, walking the judge through daily routines, educational activities, and the small victories that marked Lila's progress. Her voice shook with emotion as she described finding Lila asleep in Caleb's room after nightmares, the first time the child had voluntarily sought comfort. That man, Agnes said, pointing at Caleb, has given that little girl something no one else offered, unconditional safety. He doesn't demand she speak or smile or be anything other than what she is. And because of that acceptance, she's starting to heal. The county's lawyer tried to shake her testimony, implying she was too emotionally involved to be objective, but Agnes held firm. Then came the character witnesses. 3 of Caleb's ranch hands testified to his fairness and integrity. The general store owner spoke of his honesty in business dealings. Even Sheriff Coleman took the stand despite the political risk, describing Caleb as a man of his word who'd never shown anything but proper behavior. But Miss Thornberry had her witnesses too. A teacher from town who'd never met Lila personally, but spoke about the importance of social interaction with peers. a minister who suggested that a child needed religious education and a mother's guidance. One of the prospective families, the Hendersons, described their warm home full of children and how Lila would thrive there. "We have so much love to give," Mrs. Henderson said earnestly. "Our children are excited to have a little sister. We can provide everything she needs: a mother, a father, siblings, a place in the community." The hearing dragged on for hours. Evidence was presented, challenged, rebutted. Brooks fought brilliantly, but Caleb could see the judge's expression growing more conflicted. Finally, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the courtroom, Judge Morrison spoke. "I'd like to hear from the child." The room went silent. All eyes turned to where Lila sat beside Caleb, her small form nearly invisible in the adult-sized chair. "Your Honor," Brooks said carefully, "the child is only 3 years old and has experienced significant trauma. We're not sure—" "I understand your concern, Mr. Brooks, but this hearing is about what's best for her, and I believe she should have a voice in that decision if she's capable of expressing one." Caleb felt Lila go rigid beside him. Her breathing quickened, that terrible panicked rhythm he recognized from her worst moments. He leaned down to whisper in her ear, "You don't have to do anything. I can tell them no." But Lila was staring at the judge, then at the Henderson family sitting in the front row looking kind and expectant and like everything the board said she needed. Her hand found Caleb's and squeezed so hard her fingernails dug into his palm. Then before anyone could stop her, she slid off her chair and walked forward. The courtroom held its collective breath as this tiny child approached the judge's bench. Judge Morrison looked surprised but gestured for her to come closer. "Hello, Lila. My name is Judge Morrison. I'm trying to decide where you should live. Do you understand?" Lila nodded. "Can you tell me, do you like living with Mr. Rourke?" Another nod, more emphatic this time. "Would you like to stay with him?" Lila's whole body was trembling, but she nodded again. "Can you tell me why? Use your words if you can, sweetheart." For a long moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. Then Lila spoke, her voice small but clear in the hushed courtroom. "He doesn't hurt me." A collective intake of breath rippled through the room. The judge leaned forward. "No one should hurt you, Lila, ever. What else can you tell me about Mr. Rourke?" She struggled for words, her limited vocabulary failing to capture everything she needed to say. "He gave me Bright, and he reads stories. And when I'm scared, he stays." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she kept talking, the words coming faster as if a dam had broken. "The other place, they said nobody wanted me. They said I was broken and bad, but he—" She pointed at Caleb with a shaking hand. "He said I was his. He said I'm not going back to the dark room." Miss Thornbury stood up. "Your Honor, the child is clearly—" "Sit down," Judge Morrison said sharply. He never took his eyes off Lila. "What dark room, sweetheart?" Lila's face crumpled. "Where bad children go, where nobody comes back." The judge's expression shifted, hardening into something cold and angry. He looked at Miss Thornbury. "You want to explain that?" "I'm sure the child is confused." "She doesn't sound confused. She sounds terrified." He turned to Caleb. "Mr. Rourke, approach the bench." Caleb stood and walked forward. Lila immediately grabbed his hand. "This child is clearly attached to you," the judge said, "and clearly traumatized by her experiences before coming to your care. Mr. Brooks, did you investigate conditions at the county orphan asylum?" Brooks stood quickly. "We attempted to, Your Honor, but were denied access. However, I have affidavits from 2 former residents describing conditions consistent with what Lila just described. Isolation chambers used as punishment, inadequate food, rough treatment. I wasn't planning to introduce them unless necessary, but given the child's testimony, introduce them now." The next hour was devastating. The affidavits painted a picture of systematic abuse masked as discipline. Children locked in dark basement rooms for days, meals withheld as punishment, physical force used to enforce silence and obedience. One affidavit was from a young woman named Sarah Brennan, who'd aged out of the asylum system 2 years prior. She had described watching younger children be broken deliberately, their spirits crushed to make them compliant and easy to place. "They wanted children who wouldn't cause trouble," she'd written. who would work hard and never complain. The ones who fought back or refused to be broken were labeled defective and kept isolated. Some died there. Some were sent away to places we never heard about. The rest of us learned to survive by becoming invisible. Miss Thornberry's face had gone pale. Your Honor, these are unsubstantiated allegations from unreliable sources. They're consistent with this child's testimony and her documented trauma, Judge Morrison said coldly, and they warrant immediate investigation. Mr. Brooks, do you have more evidence? One more witness, Your Honor, Sarah Brennan herself. She's waiting outside. Sarah Brennan was 20 years old, thin and nervous, but she walked to the stand with her head high. Her testimony was quiet but devastating. She described the asylum in detail, named the staff members who participated in abuse, and identified Mrs. Pemberton, the director, as the architect of the system. She believed broken children were easier to place, Sarah said. She didn't care about helping us. She just wanted us gone, off the county's books, earning our keep somewhere else. The auctions were just a way to move inventory. When she finished, Judge Morrison sat back in his chair, his expression thunderous. He looked at Lila, still standing beside Caleb, holding his hand like a lifeline. Miss Thornberry, he said quietly, you wanted to return this child to institutional care. Knowing what you now know, do you still think that's in her best interest? Your Honor, I had no knowledge of these alleged conditions. That's not what I asked. Yes or no? Miss Thornberry's jaw worked. No, Your Honor. And these families eager to adopt her, the Hendersons, the Clarks, the Whites, where were they 2 months ago when she stood on an auction block and nobody bid? Why this sudden interest? Mrs. Henderson started to speak, but the judge held up his hand. I'll tell you why, because now she comes with a story. The tragic orphan, the wealthy rescuer, the heartwarming tale. Some of you might genuinely want to help. Others see an opportunity. But none of you were there when she needed someone most. He turned to Caleb. Mr. Rourke, you paid $5 for this child when no one else would offer a cent. Why? Caleb looked down at Lila, at her tear-stained face and frightened eyes, and the desperate trust she was trying so hard to maintain. Because nobody should be worth nothing, he said simply. Because she was alone and scared and heading somewhere worse than where she'd been. Because I couldn't walk away and live with myself. Do you love her? The question caught Caleb off guard. Love. He'd avoided that word, avoided thinking too deeply about what he felt. Love meant vulnerability, meant opening yourself to loss. He'd sworn he'd never do that again. But Lila was looking up at him, waiting for his answer, and he couldn't lie to her. Not now, not ever. Yes, he said, his voice rough. Yes, I love her. She's mine, and I'm hers, and that's not going to change. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Then he picked up his gavel. I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Rourke. The petition to remove Lila Grace Morrison from his custody is denied. Furthermore, I'm formalizing the adoption. Mr. Rourke, you are hereby granted full legal parental rights. This child is yours in every sense of the word. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the sudden chaos of the courtroom. Lila made a sound, half sob, half laugh, and threw herself at Caleb. He caught her, lifting her up, and she wrapped her arms around his neck so tightly he could barely breathe. I'm also ordering an immediate investigation into conditions at the county orphan asylum, the judge continued over the noise. Sheriff Coleman, I want Mrs. Pemberton and her senior staff detained for questioning. Miss Thornberry, you're suspended pending review of your role in this system, and someone get me the names of every child currently in that facility. I want them examined by independent physicians within the week. Agnes was crying openly, her hands pressed to her mouth. Evan Brooks looked stunned but triumphant. The would-be adoptive families filed out quietly, some looking ashamed, others merely disappointed. Miss Thornberry stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and denial. Your Honor, I was only doing my duty. Your duty was to protect children, not maintain a system that brutalized them. Get out of my courtroom. As the room slowly emptied, Caleb stood there holding Lila, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, her tears soaking into his collar. She was saying something into his shoulder, the same words over and over, so quiet he almost couldn't hear them. Don't let go. Please don't let go. Never, he promised, his own voice breaking. I'm never letting go. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. Lila sat pressed against Caleb's side in the wagon, her small hand clutching his coat, and for the first time since he'd known her, she didn't look like she was bracing for the world to collapse around her. Agnes sat on Lila's other side, one arm around the child's shoulders, tears still tracking down her weathered cheeks. It's over, Agnes kept whispering. It's really over. But Caleb knew better. The legal battle was over, yes. The threat of separation had been lifted, but the real work, the work of helping Lila truly heal, was only beginning. Judge Morrison's ruling had given them time and safety, but it couldn't erase what had been done to her. That would take something much harder to give than money or legal arguments. When they arrived home, the sun was setting in brilliant shades of orange and purple across the western sky. Caleb lifted Lila down from the wagon, and she immediately ran to the barn, her new shoes kicking up dust. He followed and found her in Bright's stall, her arms wrapped around the young horse's neck, her face buried in his mane. He's getting big, Caleb observed, leaning against the stall door. Won't be long before we can start training him properly. Lila looked up, her eyes still red from crying, but clearer than he'd ever seen them. Can I help? The words were soft but deliberate, and Caleb felt that now familiar tightening in his chest. Each word she spoke felt like a small miracle. Of course you can help. He's your horse, after all. You named him. Mine? She looked between Caleb and the foal, disbelief and hope warring on her small face. Yours, just like you're mine. That's what family means. We belong to each other. She tested the word silently, her lips moving around the shape of it. Family. Then she nodded, turning back to stroke Bright's nose with gentle fingers. That night, Caleb expected Lila to sleep peacefully, the threat of separation finally lifted. Instead, her nightmares returned worse than ever. He woke to find her standing beside his bed, shaking so violently her teeth chattered, tears streaming silently down her face. Come here, he said, lifting the blankets. She climbed in and curled against him, but she couldn't seem to stop shaking. Her breathing came in sharp, painful gasps. What is it? Caleb asked gently. You're safe now. The judge said so. Nobody can take you away. They came back, she whispered. In my dream. They said it was a mistake. They said I had to go to the dark room. Caleb's arms tightened around her. That's not going to happen. The judge's ruling is final. You're legally mine now. It's written down in official papers and everything. Do you know what that means? She shook her head against his chest. It means even if someone wanted to take you away, they couldn't. The law says you belong here. With me. Forever. Promise? I promise. And I never break my promises. Gradually her shaking subsided, but she didn't fall back asleep. She just lay there in the darkness, holding on to Caleb's shirt with both hands. Can you tell me about the dark room? He asked quietly. You don't have to if you don't want to, but sometimes talking about scary things makes them less scary. For a long time she didn't respond. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. It was in the basement, no windows, just dark and cold and empty. If you were bad, if you cried or talked back or didn't eat everything or tried to run away, they put you there, sometimes for a whole day, sometimes longer. How long were you there? 3 days once, because I wouldn't stop looking for my mama even though they said she was dead and never coming back. Caleb felt rage surge through him, hot and violent, but he kept his voice gentle. That was cruel. You weren't bad for missing your mother. You were a little girl who lost someone she loved. They said I needed to learn that the real world doesn't care about crying or missing people, that I had to be tough. You are tough, the toughest person I know. But being tough doesn't mean you can't be sad or scared or miss people. It just means you keep going even when things are hard. He brushed her hair back from her forehead. And you don't have to be tough all the time anymore. Not here. Here you can cry if you need to. You can be scared. You can be a little girl instead of a survivor. I'll be tough enough for both of us. She was quiet for a moment. Then, what if I'm broken? Miss Thornberry said I was broken. You're not broken. You're hurt. There's a difference. Broken things can't be fixed, but hurt things can heal. And you're already healing. I can see it every day. How do you know? Because you're talking to me right now. Because you named Bright. Because you let Agnes hug you yesterday. Because you're asking questions and wanting answers instead of just disappearing inside yourself. That's not broken, Lila. That's brave. She absorbed this silently, her breathing finally evening out. Just when Caleb thought she'd fallen asleep, she spoke again. In the dream, you weren't there. I called for you, but you didn't come. I'll always come. Always. Even in the middle of the night, even if I'm tired or busy or all the way across the ranch. If you need me, I'll be there. What if something happens to you? It was a child's question, but it came from a place of deep trauma. The knowledge that people could disappear, that safety could be ripped away without warning. Nothing's going to happen to me, Caleb said. I'm strong and healthy and careful, but if something did happen, Agnes would take care of you. And I've already talked to Evan Brooks about making sure you'd never go back to an institution. You'd stay here, on this ranch, no matter what. With Agnes? With Agnes. This is your home now. These are your people. That doesn't change. Finally, she slept, her small body relaxing against his. Caleb lay awake, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling, thinking about the responsibility he'd taken on. This child trusted him now, depended on him, and the weight of that was both terrifying and oddly right. The next morning, Agnes found them still asleep in Caleb's bed. Lila sprawled across his chest like a starfish, his arm protectively around her. She stood in the doorway for a moment, a soft smile on her face, before quietly retreating to start breakfast. Over the following weeks, the fallout from the hearing spread through Clemens Ridge like wildfire. The investigation into the county orphan asylum moved quickly once Judge Morrison applied pressure. Mrs. Pemberton was arrested, along with 2 of her senior staff members. The testimonies from current and former residents painted a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even the most hardened lawmen. Caleb followed the news with grim satisfaction, but his main focus remained on Lila. The legal victory had given her security, but healing couldn't be rushed or forced. Some days she seemed almost like a normal child, playing with Bright, helping Agnes in the kitchen, even laughing at Caleb's terrible attempts to tell jokes. Other days the trauma would resurface and she'd retreat into silence, hoarding food again, flinching at sudden movements. Dr. Matthias visited regularly, monitoring her progress and offering advice. She's doing remarkably well, he told Caleb after one examination. But you need to understand, trauma this severe doesn't heal in a straight line. There will be setbacks, triggers you don't expect. The key is consistency. Keep being exactly what you've been, steady, safe, patient. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that blanketed the ranch in pristine white. Lila had never seen snow before, or if she had, she didn't remember it. The morning she woke to find the world transformed, she pressed her face against the window in wonder. "Can I go outside?" she asked, turning to Caleb with an excitement he'd never seen before. "After breakfast. We'll bundle you up warm and you can play as long as you want." She could barely sit still through the meal, bouncing in her chair and asking a stream of questions. "Will it be cold? Can I touch it? Will Bright like the snow? Can I make a snowman like in the picture book?" Agnes laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Listen to you chattering away like any child your age should. It's music to my ears." After breakfast, they dressed Lila in layers. Wool stockings, warm pants under her dress, a heavy coat Agnes had sewn, mittens, and a knitted cap. She looked like a small, overstuffed doll, but she was warm. The moment her feet touched the snow, she stopped, eyes wide. Then she laughed, a sound Caleb had never heard from her before, pure and delighted and completely unguarded. She scooped up a handful of snow, watching it sparkle in the morning sun. "It's magic," she breathed. Caleb showed her how to make snowballs, and she immediately threw one at him, her aim terrible, but her joy infectious. They built a lopsided snowman together while Agnes watched from the porch, and for those few hours, Lila was simply a child playing in the snow, unburdened by everything she'd survived. But even joy had its limits. That afternoon, Lila came inside shivering and exhausted. Agnes made hot cocoa and settled her by the fire with blankets, and within minutes the child was asleep, her cheeks still flushed from the cold. She's beautiful when she smiles, Agnes said quietly, watching her sleep. You'd never know what she's been through. I'll always know, Caleb said, and I'll always make sure nobody hurts her like that again. As winter deepened, life on the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Caleb taught Lila to read, sitting with her every evening by the fire, sounding out words and praising every small success. She absorbed knowledge like a sponge, asking endless questions about everything she saw and heard. Agnes taught her cooking and sewing, practical skills, but also opportunities for connection. They'd spend hours in the kitchen, Agnes telling stories about her own children while Lila carefully measured flour or stirred batter. And Caleb taught her about the ranch, how to care for animals, how to read weather signs, how to move quietly around horses so they wouldn't spook. Bright became her constant companion when she wasn't in the house, and the bond between girl and horse grew stronger every day. But the world outside the ranch hadn't forgotten about them. In late December, Evan Brooks arrived with news. The investigation is complete, he said, settling into a chair in Caleb's study. Mrs. Pemberton and her staff are facing criminal charges. The asylum is being shut down permanently. What about the other children? Caleb asked. That's why I'm here. There were 14 children still in the facility. Most have been placed with relatives who were located after actual effort was made to find them. But there are 3 who have no family and... Brooks hesitated. They're in bad shape, Caleb. Worse than Lila was. What are you asking me? The county is scrambling to find placements. After what happened with Lila, there's pressure to find good homes, not just convenient ones. Judge Morrison asked if you might consider... No. Caleb's response was immediate and firm. I can barely handle 1 traumatized child. I can't take on 3 more. I'm not suggesting all 3, but there's one boy, about 5 years old, Noah. He's been at the asylum since he was an infant. He doesn't speak at all, makes Lila's early silence look like constant chatter. They're worried about finding anyone willing to take him on. Why are you telling me this? Brooks leaned forward. Because you did something extraordinary with Lila. You gave her a chance when nobody else would, and now she's thriving. This boy deserves the same chance. I'm not a saint, Brooks. I'm just a rancher who got lucky with 1 damaged child. That doesn't make me qualified to save every orphan in the county. I'm not asking you to save every orphan. I'm asking you to meet 1 boy and see if you can help. Caleb wanted to refuse outright, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of Lila on that auction block. Maybe it was knowing what these children had endured. Maybe it was the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his late wife, telling him that having the ability to help meant having the responsibility to try. I'll meet him, he said finally. That's all I'm promising, 1 meeting. That evening he told Lila about the visit. She was sitting on the floor playing with a set of wooden blocks he'd bought her for Christmas, building elaborate structures and knocking them down with gleeful abandon. There's a boy who might come visit us, Caleb said carefully. He's about 5 years old, and he's had a hard time just like you did. I'm going to meet him and see if maybe he could come live here too. Lila's hand stilled on the blocks. Another child? Maybe. I don't know yet. How would you feel about that? She was quiet for a long moment, her expression serious. Will you love him like you love me? The question pierced Caleb's heart. If he comes to live here, I'll take care of him and keep him safe. But nobody could replace you, Lila. You were first. You'll always be first. She seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. Okay, he can visit. The meeting was arranged for early January. Sheriff Coleman brought Noah to the ranch on a cold, clear morning. The boy who climbed down from the wagon was small for his age, with dark hair and enormous brown eyes that held the same emptiness Caleb remembered from Lila. Noah, this is Mr. Rourke, Sheriff Coleman said gently. He'd like to talk to you for a bit. Noah didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that he'd heard. He stood perfectly still, arms at his sides, staring at nothing. Caleb recognized that stance immediately, the survival posture of a child who'd learned that being invisible was the safest option. Hello, Noah, Caleb said quietly. I'm Caleb. This is my ranch. Would you like to look around? No response. He doesn't talk, the sheriff said. Hasn't said a word since they found him in the asylum. The doctors think maybe he never learned how. Agnes emerged from the house with Lila at her side. The little girl had been nervous all morning, alternating between excitement and anxiety about meeting another child. Noah's eyes flickered toward them, the first sign of interest he'd shown. His gaze fixed on Lila with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Lila stepped forward slowly, approaching Noah the way Caleb had taught her to approach nervous horses. Steady, calm, non-threatening. When she was a few feet away, she held out her hand. "I'm Lila," she said softly. "I used to be scared too, but it's safe here. I promise." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Noah's hand moved just slightly, reaching toward hers. Their fingers touched briefly before he pulled back, but it was contact. Connection. Lila smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed her whole face. "Do you want to see my horse? His name is Bright, and he's very nice." She didn't wait for an answer, just started walking toward the barn. After a moment's hesitation, Noah followed. Caleb and the sheriff watched them go, two small figures crossing the snowy yard toward the barn. "Well," Sheriff Coleman said, "that's more reaction than we've gotten out of him in weeks." Inside the barn, Lila showed Noah around with careful pride. She introduced him to each horse, explained their names and personalities, and finally brought him to Bright's stall. "This is my horse," she said. "Caleb gave him to me because I named him. He was born right here, and I watched the whole thing. You can pet him if you want. He likes it when you scratch behind his ears." Noah stared at the young horse, his expression unreadable. Then, moving slowly, he reached through the stall bars and touched Bright's nose. The horse snuffled at his hand gently. Something shifted in Noah's face. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The barest softening of that terrible, rigid control. Caleb watched from the barn door, remembering the first time Lila had shown interest in the horses, the first crack in her armor of silence. He saw himself reflected in this moment, saw the choice he'd made on that auction block playing out in real time as Lila offered this traumatized boy the same kindness she'd been given. The visit lasted 2 hours. Noah didn't speak, didn't smile, barely moved, but he stayed close to Lila, following her around the ranch as she showed him everything she considered important. The chickens, the garden patch covered in snow, the swing Caleb had built, the kitchen where Agnes made cookies and always had warm milk ready. When it was time for Noah to leave, Lila gave him the wooden horse Caleb had carved for her months ago. "You can keep this," she said, pressing it into his hands. "It helped me feel brave. Maybe it'll help you too." Noah clutched the carving to his chest, his eyes meeting Lila's for a brief, intense moment. Something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, shared knowledge of what it meant to survive when survival was all you had. After the sheriff's wagon disappeared down the road, Caleb found Lila sitting on her bed, staring at her hands. "That was a kind thing you did," he said, sitting beside her, "giving him your horse. He needed it more than me. I have Bright, and I have you and Agnes. He doesn't have anything." "Did you like having another child here?" She was quiet for a moment. "He's scared like I was. Nobody should be that scared." "No, they shouldn't." Caleb took a deep breath. "Lila, if I brought Noah here to live with us, would that be all right with you?" Her eyes went wide. "Really? He could stay?" "If you want him to. It would be a big change. You wouldn't be the only child anymore. I'd have to spend time taking care of him too." Lila thought about this seriously, her small face scrunched in concentration. Then she nodded. "He should come. Everyone should have a place where they don't have to be scared." And that was how, 2 weeks later, Noah became part of their family. The adoption process was faster this time. Judge Morrison expedited everything after seeing Lila's transformation. Noah arrived on a snowy February morning, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the wooden horse Lila had given him. The first weeks were harder than with Lila. Noah was older, more damaged, more entrenched in his silence. He didn't sleep for days, just sat in the chair in his room staring at the wall. He refused to eat unless Lila sat with him. He wouldn't let anyone touch him, not even for basic care. But Lila became his bridge to the world. She'd sit beside him in silence, both of them just existing together. She'd bring him to the barn and show him how to brush the horses. She'd share her picture books, not expecting him to read or even look, just making space for him next to her. Caleb watched them together and saw something remarkable unfolding. Lila, once so broken herself, was teaching Noah how to heal by example. She showed him that adults could be safe, that home could be permanent, that you could survive the unsurvivable and still find joy on the other side. It was Agnes who first heard Noah speak, 3 months after his arrival. She was baking bread while both children sat at the kitchen table working on their letters. Lila was helping Noah form the letters of his name when Agnes heard a small voice say, "Thank you." She turned so fast she nearly knocked over the flour. Noah was looking at Lila with something almost like a smile on his face. "You're welcome," Lila said simply, as if children who'd been silent for years spoke every day. That night, Caleb sat on the porch watching the sun set over his land. 2 children slept safely in his house now. 2 children who'd been deemed worthless by a system that should have protected them. 2 children who were learning, slowly and painfully, that they deserved to take up space in the world. Agnes joined him, settling into the chair beside his. "You know there are more," she said quietly. "More what?" "More children like Lila and Noah. Children nobody wants. Children the system has broken or given up on." "I can't save them all, Agnes." "No, but you saved 2, and those 2 will save others someday, in ways we can't even imagine yet." Caleb thought about Lila giving Noah her wooden horse, thought about how she'd reached out to another wounded soul despite her own pain, thought about the way Noah had finally spoken because a little girl had shown him that words could be safe. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe that's enough." Inside, Lila woke from a dream. Not a nightmare this time, just a dream about horses running free across endless grasslands. She got up and padded down the hall to check on Noah, something she'd started doing every night. He was asleep in his bed, the wooden horse clutched in one hand, the red bandana Caleb had given Lila, which she'd passed on to Noah, tucked under his pillow. She returned to her own room and climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. Through her window, she could see stars scattered across the dark sky like diamonds. Bright was safe in the barn. Agnes was asleep downstairs. Caleb was just down the hall. She was home. Really, truly home. And for the first time in her short life, Lila Grace Morrison fell asleep believing in tomorrow. The years passed in a way that felt both impossibly fast and comfortably slow, marked by seasons changing and children growing, and the gradual transformation of a lonely ranch into something that felt like the home Caleb had lost so long ago. Spring brought foals and planting. Summer meant long days working the cattle and evenings reading on the porch. Fall was harvest and preparation for winter. And winter was the family drawn close around the fire, safe and warm, while snow fell outside. Lila turned 7 the summer that everything changed again. She'd grown tall and lean, her blonde hair now long enough to braid, her eyes no longer empty but alive with curiosity and mischief, and a fierce protectiveness toward those she loved. She could read better than most children twice her age, rode bright like she'd been born in the saddle, and had developed a stubborn streak that both exasperated and secretly delighted Caleb. Noah was 9 now, still quieter than most children but no longer silent. He spoke in careful, deliberate sentences, choosing his words like they were precious things not to be wasted. He'd become Caleb's shadow, following him around the ranch and absorbing everything about ranching and animal care with intense focus. Where Lila was fire and motion, Noah was stillness and observation. Together, they were an odd but balanced pair, different in temperament, but united in their understanding of what it meant to have survived something terrible and come out the other side. It was Agnes who first noticed the pattern. 3 times that summer, parents from town had come to the ranch asking Caleb's advice about troubled children. A boy who wouldn't speak after witnessing his father's death, a girl who'd been orphaned and was destroying everything she touched, another child so withdrawn the family feared they'd never reach him. "You're building a reputation," Agnes told Caleb one evening after the 3rd such visit. "People are starting to see what you did with Lila and Noah, and they're hoping you can work the same magic with their children." "It's not magic," Caleb said gruffly. "It's just patience and not giving up." "Exactly, which is more than most people have to give." The visits continued, and Caleb found himself offering advice drawn from his years with Lila and Noah. Let them come to you in their own time. Don't force affection or speech or anything else. Just be consistently present. Create safety first, everything else follows. Sometimes the parents listened, sometimes they didn't. But word spread that the reclusive rancher who'd fought the county to keep a traumatized child had something to teach about loving the supposedly unlovable. It was Lila who brought up the idea that would change everything. She and Noah were helping Caleb mend a fence line on a warm September afternoon when she suddenly stopped working and looked at him with that serious expression that meant she'd been thinking hard about something. "There are more children," she said, "like we were." "I know. And nobody wants them because they're too broken, or too scared, or too difficult." Caleb set down his hammer, recognizing the determination in her voice. "What are you thinking, Lila?" "We could help them, like you helped us. We have space here. We have food and horses and safety. We could bring them here." "Lila, running a ranch and raising 2 children is already—" "I could help," she interrupted. "I'm good with scared kids. I know what they need because I needed it too. And Noah could help. Right, Noah?" Noah nodded slowly. "People listen different when it comes from other kids. When Lila told me it was safe here, I believed her faster than I believed grown-ups." Caleb looked at these 2 children he'd taken in, now proposing to help save others. Part of him wanted to say no, to protect the fragile peace they'd built. But he remembered standing at that auction block, remembered the choice that had changed all their lives. "Let me think about it," he said. That night, he sat with Agnes in the kitchen long after the children were asleep. "They want to turn the ranch into some kind of haven for damaged children," he said, only half joking. "And what do you want?" Caleb was quiet for a long time. "I never expected to have a family again. After Margaret and the baby died, I thought that door was closed forever, but Lila and Noah, they gave me something I thought I'd lost. Purpose. Connection. A reason to be better than I was. So what's stopping you from saying yes?" "Fear, mostly. Fear of failing them. Fear of taking on more than I can handle. Fear of losing what we have." Agnes reached across the table and took his hand. "Caleb Rourke, you're the most capable man I know. You run thousands of acres, manage dozens of workers, and you've raised 2 of the most resilient children I've ever met. If anyone can do this, it's you. It wouldn't be just me. I'd need help, real help, not just good intentions. Then we'll get help. We'll hire more staff. We'll bring in teachers. We'll do whatever it takes." She squeezed his hand. "Those children out there, the ones everyone's given up on, they deserve what Lila and Noah got. A chance. Safety. Someone who won't give up on them. You gave that to 2 children. Imagine what you could do for 10 or 20. Over the following months, Caleb worked with Evan Brooks and Judge Morrison to create something unprecedented in the county. A private children's home on the ranch, licensed and regulated, but run on principles of patience and respect rather than discipline and control. The judge helped to navigate the legal complexities. Brooks handled the paperwork and contracts, and Caleb poured money into expanding the house, building a schoolroom, and hiring staff who understood that damaged children needed time and safety more than rules and punishment. The first new child arrived in December, a 10-year-old girl named Sarah who'd been shuffled through 5 different placements in 2 years. She came with a reputation for violence and destruction, for attacking anyone who tried to show her kindness. Lila met her at the door with a directness that made Caleb's breath catch. "You're angry," she said simply. "I get it. Being angry is easier than being scared, but you're safe here. Even if you break things or yell or hit, we're not going to send you away. You can stop fighting now." Sarah stared at this small blonde girl speaking uncomfortable truths, and something in her expression cracked. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're here because nobody else wanted to deal with you. I know what that feels like. Everyone thought I was broken too." Lila held out her hand. "I'm Lila. That's my brother Noah. We're going to show you around." It took weeks for Sarah to trust them. Weeks of testing boundaries and pushing limits and waiting to be rejected. But every time she lashed out, Caleb responded with the same steady consistency he'd shown Lila years ago. Every time she destroyed something, he helped her clean it up without anger or punishment. Every time she screamed that she hated it here and wanted to leave, he simply said she was welcome to feel however she felt, but she wasn't going anywhere. Eventually, slowly, Sarah began to heal. She formed an unlikely friendship with Noah, who understood her silence when words failed. She learned to ride from Lila, who pushed her to be braver while never demanding more than she could give. And she learned from Caleb that safety didn't have to be earned or maintained through perfect behavior. It was just given, freely and permanently. More children came. A pair of brothers who'd been separated by the system and reunited at the ranch. A boy with a club foot who'd been rejected by potential families who only wanted perfect children. A girl so traumatized by abuse she couldn't bear to be in a room with men until Caleb spent months proving he was different. Each child brought their own wounds, their own defensive walls, their own desperate need for someone to prove the world wasn't entirely cruel. And each child found what Lila and Noah had found, a place where broken didn't mean worthless, where healing could happen at its own pace, where family was built through choice rather than blood. By the time Lila turned 12, the ranch housed 15 children ranging in age from 4 to 14. The original house had been expanded twice. A proper school building stood near the barn, staffed by teachers who understood trauma. The dinner table seated 20, and meal times were loud with conversation and laughter and the comfortable chaos of a large family. Caleb watched it all with a mixture of pride and wonder, still sometimes unable to believe this was his life. The lonely widower who'd wanted nothing but isolation had somehow become the center of a sprawling, unconventional family. It was Lila who articulated what they'd built one evening when she found Caleb sitting on the porch watching the sunset. She was 12 now, poised on the edge of becoming a young woman, still fierce and stubborn, but tempered with a wisdom born from experience. "You know what you did, right?" she said, settling beside him. "Built a home for unwanted children?" "No, well, yes, but more than that. You proved that we weren't the problem, the system was. All those people who said we were too damaged or too difficult, they were wrong. We just needed someone willing to see past the broken parts to who we really were." Caleb put his arm around her shoulders. "You did that as much as I did. You and Noah showed the other children it was possible to heal. You gave them hope. You gave us hope first. That day at the auction, when everyone else saw a worthless child, you saw someone worth fighting for. That changed everything." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. Then Lila asked the question she'd been building toward. "There are more auctions, more children being sold like we were. What if we could stop it? Not just save a few, but change the whole system?" "That's a big dream, Lila. You taught me to dream big. You taught me that one person making one choice could change everything. So what if we made bigger choices? What if we fought to make sure no child ever had to stand on that platform again?" Over the next year, that conversation became action. Lila, now 13 and already showing the fierce advocacy that would define her life, began speaking publicly about her experiences. She testified before the state legislature about conditions in orphan asylums. She wrote letters to newspapers describing the auction system and demanding reform. She was young but compelling, her story impossible to dismiss or ignore. Noah joined her, his quiet intensity providing counterpoint to her fire. Where Lila spoke with passion, Noah offered careful, detailed accounts of systematic failures. Together they became the faces of a movement demanding better treatment for orphaned and abandoned children. Caleb supported them while wrestling with his own complicated feelings. He was proud of their courage, but terrified of them being hurt or exploited. He wanted them to change the world, but also wanted to protect them from the cruelty of people who'd resist that change. "Let them go," Agnes told him one night. "They're not little children anymore. They're survivors who found their voices. The best thing you can do is support them." The reforms came slowly but steadily. The auction system was abolished first, replaced by proper adoption procedures and oversight. Then came regulations for orphan asylums, requiring inspections and accountability. The dark rooms were outlawed. Corporal punishment was restricted. Children were given voices in their own placements. It wasn't perfect. Systems rarely were. But it was better. Substantially, measurably better. And at the center of every reform was the testimony of children who'd survived the old system and refused to let it continue unchanged. The ranch continued to grow and evolve. Some children stayed until adulthood, finding in Caleb's home the permanence they'd never had. Others healed enough to be adopted by families who'd learned from the ranch's example how to love damaged children. A few came for only months before moving on, but they carried with them the knowledge that safety existed, that healing was possible, that they were worth fighting for. Lila turned 18 on a brilliant summer day, surrounded by the chaotic, loving family she'd helped build. She'd been accepted to a prestigious Eastern college to study law, planning to formalize her advocacy work into a career protecting children's rights. But before she left, she wanted to do something she'd been planning for months. "I want to go back," she told Caleb, "to Clemens Ridge, to the spot where the auction platform used to be." They rode into town together, just the two of them, on a morning that felt both ordinary and momentous. The town had changed in the years since that terrible day. The auction platform was long gone, replaced by a small park with benches and flowers. But Lila stood on the exact spot where she'd once been unwanted, unloved, dismissed as worthless. "I was so scared," she said quietly. "I remember standing here thinking this was the end, that I'd either die in the dark room or survive as something less than human. I couldn't imagine anything better. But you did survive, and you became something extraordinary." She turned to face him, tears streaming down her face, but smiling. "Because you saw me, really saw me. When everyone else looked at a broken child, you saw someone worth saving. You were always worth saving, Lila. I just gave you the space to prove it." She threw her arms around him, and Caleb held his daughter, because that's what she was, in every way that mattered, and felt the weight of their shared journey settle into something like peace. "I'm going to spend my life making sure other children get what you gave me," Lila said. "Safety, choice, someone who won't give up on them. I'm going to change laws and fight systems and never stop until every child knows they're worth something." "I know you will. You're the strongest person I've ever known. I learned from the best." Noah graduated 2 years later and chose to stay at the ranch, taking over more of the daily operations and working with the younger children. Where Lila fought systemic battles, Noah fought individual ones, giving traumatized children the patient, steady presence he'd once needed himself. Agnes worked until she was 70, finally retiring but refusing to leave the ranch. "This is my home too," she said firmly when Caleb suggested she might want a quieter life in town. "These are my children, all of them. I'm staying." The ranch became known throughout the state and beyond as a model for child welfare. Social workers brought their most difficult cases. Judges sent children who'd failed in traditional placements, and one by one, they found healing in the same patient acceptance that had saved Lila and Noah. Caleb aged into the role of patriarch with surprising grace. His hair went completely gray, his hands grew gnarled from decades of hard work, but his steady presence never wavered. He was the anchor every child needed, the proof that some promises were kept, that some people never gave up, that safety could be permanent. On his 70th birthday, the entire extended family gathered at the ranch. Not just the children currently in residence, but the dozens who'd grown up and moved on, bringing their own children and partners and stories of lives rebuilt from ruins. The house and yard overflowed with people, noise, laughter, and the beautiful chaos of connection. Lila returned from the state capitol, where she'd been arguing a landmark case about children's rights. She found Caleb on the porch, watching the celebration with quiet satisfaction. "Still think you're not capable of saving every orphan in the county?" she teased, echoing his words from years ago. "I didn't save them. I just gave them a place where they could save themselves." "That's the same thing, you stubborn old man." They watched together as Noah taught a group of younger children how to saddle horses, his movements patient and gentle. Watched as Sarah, now a teacher at the ranch school, worked with a shy 7-year-old who reminded Caleb painfully of Lila at that age. Watched as children who'd arrived broken and terrified now played freely, their laughter carrying on the warm evening air. "Do you ever regret it?" Lila asked. "Taking me in that day? Taking on all of this?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the question. He thought about Margaret and the baby he'd lost, about the years of isolation and grief. Thought about the moment he'd stepped forward at that auction, not knowing it would change everything. Thought about sleepless nights and difficult days and the exhausting work of loving traumatized children. Thought about Lila's first word, Noah's first smile, and all the small miracles that had followed. "Not for a second," he said finally. "You gave me my life back, you and Noah and all the children who came after. I thought I was saving you, but really, You saved me." Lila leaned her head on his shoulder, the way she'd done as a child. "We saved each other. That's what family does." As the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Caleb Rourke looked at the family he'd built from broken pieces and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: completeness, rightness, the bone-deep satisfaction of a life well lived. He thought about that day at the auction, about the split-second choice to step forward when he could have walked away. One decision made in a moment of compassion. One child pulled from the edge of darkness. And from that single choice had grown this: a family spanning generations, a model that changed systems, a legacy of proving that broken things could be made whole. Years later, after Caleb had passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, they held the memorial service at the ranch. Hundreds came. Children he'd raised, now adults with children of their own. Social workers and judges whose practices had been transformed by his example. Politicians who'd changed laws based on testimony from his children. And at the center of it all, Lila stood before the crowd and told their story. She talked about a terrified 3-year-old girl standing on an auction block, about a grieving widower who chose compassion over isolation, about the slow, patient work of building trust and proving safety, about a family created through choice rather than blood, through persistence rather than perfection. "He used to say he was just a rancher who got lucky," Lila said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "But it wasn't luck. It was love. The stubborn, persistent kind of love that refuses to give up even when giving up would be easier. The kind of love that sees value where others see worthlessness. The kind of love that changes everything." She looked out at the faces watching her, so many of them children who'd been saved by that same stubborn love, who'd grown up to save others in turn. "My father taught me that one person making one choice could rewrite a life, that one act of courage could echo across generations. He proved it by choosing me when nobody else would. And in doing so, he gave all of us the greatest gift possible, the knowledge that we were worth fighting for." The ranch continued after Caleb's death, operated now by Noah and a board of former residents. It had evolved into a full therapeutic facility, combining the ranch's original patient approach with modern trauma-informed care. Lila, now a renowned child advocate and author, served on the board while maintaining her law practice focused on children's rights. But the heart of it remained the same. Children arrived broken, believing themselves worthless, expecting rejection. And one by one, they learned what Lila had learned on that terrible and transformative day when a stranger stepped forward and changed everything. They learned that nobody was beyond saving, that healing was possible, that family could be built from choice and courage, that one person caring enough to fight could make all the difference. Years became decades. The children who'd been saved grew up to save others. The ranch's model spread to other states, other countries. Laws changed. Systems improved. The auction blocks disappeared into shameful history. And at the center of it all remained the story of a little girl nobody wanted and a man who decided she deserved better. A story that proved the extraordinary power of ordinary courage. A story that continued to echo through every child who found safety, every family built on choice, every life transformed by someone refusing to give up. In the ranch's small cemetery, beneath a massive oak tree, 2 headstones stood side by side. Caleb Rourke's was simple, bearing his name and dates and a single line chosen by his children. He saw worth where others saw nothing. Beside it, space waited for Lila's eventual resting place, though she continued her work well into her 70s, still fierce, still fighting, still proving that survivors could become warriors. But on quiet mornings, when she visited the ranch and stood beneath that oak tree, she'd remember. Remember standing on that platform in terror and despair. Remember a deep voice saying hold and everything changing. Remember the slow, patient journey from broken to whole. And she'd whisper to the man who'd saved her, "Thank you for seeing me, for choosing me, for never giving up. You said I gave you your life back, but you gave me mine first. Everything I am, everything I've done, everything I've saved, it started with you. With one choice. With one man deciding that nobody deserves to be worth nothing." The wind would rustle through the oak leaves, carrying her words across the ranch, where children still played and healed and learned that they were valuable beyond measure, where broken things were made whole, where family was built one choice at a time, and somewhere in that wind, in the laughter of healing children and the quiet strength of those who refused to give up on them, the echo of that original choice continued. A rich cowboy stepped onto a stage. A sobbing child found hope. A life was rewritten. A legacy was born. And love, stubborn, patient, transformative love, changed everything.